What happens when a single moment of prejudice, a casual act of disrespect in the sterile, pressurized cabin of a state-of-the-art airliner, collides with a truth so powerful it shatters a man's entire world? This isn't just a story about a rude pilot and a passenger. It's a story about a decorated captain, a man at the pinnacle of his career who makes a devastating assumption. He dismisses a quiet black man's question, only to have the very foundations of his reality crumble when the CEO of the airline walks into the cockpit, looks at the passenger, and calls him son. Stay with me for a story of hidden identity. Shocking revelations and karma delivered at 30,000 feet. The first-class lounge of Aurajet at JFK International was a hushed cathedral of modern luxury. Polished chrome and soft leather absorbed the frantic energy of the airport beyond its frosted glass walls, creating a serene bubble for the privileged few. Here, the clinking of ice in a crystal tumbler was the loudest sound, a gentle percussion against the low hum of filtered air and whispered conversations about mergers and market caps. Marcus Thorne felt like an imposter. Not because he couldn't afford it. He could have bought the lounge and everything in it 10 times over, but because he never felt at home in these gilded cages. Dressed in a simple, well-worn but clean grey hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of unassuming sneakers, he sat in a corner nursing a bottle of water. His laptop was open, displaying complex aeronautical schematics, the passion he'd pursued with an academic fervor, but never as a career. He was 26 with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that held a quiet, observant quality. He preferred the raw data of engine performance charts to the empty calories of small talk. His father, Robert Thorne, the formidable founder and CEO of Aurajet, had insisted he fly back to Los Angeles on their flagship A350neo. "Experience the product, Marcus," he'd said, his voice a familiar blend of command and affection. "See it from the customer's side. See if we're living up to the promise." Marcus had agreed, but on his own terms. No fanfare, no special treatment. He booked his ticket under a variation of his middle name, M. James, paid with his personal credit card, and walked into the airport like any other passenger. He wanted to see the real Aurajet, not the polished performance put on for the boss's son. The boarding call for flight AJ-77, non-stop to LAX, echoed softly through the lounge. Marcus packed his laptop, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and joined the discreet line of passengers heading for the gate. He shuffled along with the quiet flow of tailored suits and designer handbags, an anonymous island of grey cotton in a sea of expensive wool and silk. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, the massive Rolls-Royce Trent XWB engine of the Airbus came into view through a window, a marvel of engineering that made his heart beat a little faster. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a genuine, lifelong aviation geek. He'd spent his youth building model airplanes, devouring pilot memoirs, and eventually earning his own private pilot's license. He knew this aircraft, theoretically, inside and out. He found his seat 2A, a spacious pod with its own door. As other passengers settled, he heard a voice, crisp and authoritative, cut through the cabin's calm. "All right, Sarah, let's have the pre-departure checks finalized. I want to be off the gate precisely on time. The winds over the Rockies are looking a bit temperamental today." The voice belonged to Captain Alan Evans. He stood for a moment at the entrance to the cockpit, a man who seemed sculpted from the very concept of command. He was in his late 50s with a perfectly coiffed silver mane, a jawline that could cut glass, and a posture so ramrod straight it seemed to defy gravity. His uniform was immaculate, the 4 gold bars on his epaulets gleaming under the cabin lights. He was the picture of a veteran pilot, radiating an aura of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He scanned the first-class cabin, his eyes briefly flicking over Marcus, a momentary, almost imperceptible tightening at the corner of his mouth, before moving on. It was a look Marcus knew well, the swift dismissive appraisal that categorized him as out of place. Marcus ignored it, turning his attention back to the window. The ground crew moved with practiced efficiency below. The flight attendants, led by a warm and professional woman named Sarah, performed their duties with a grace that was the hallmark of Aurajet service. Everything was perfect. Almost. Just before the main cabin door was sealed, Marcus noticed the cockpit door was still ajar. It was a small breach of standard procedure, but not unheard of during the final moments of boarding. He could hear Captain Evans speaking to his first officer, a younger man named David Miller. "Another plane full of entitled bloggers and trust fund kids," Evans muttered, his voice a low grumble meant only for his co-pilot, yet just audible enough for Marcus to catch. "Just smile, fly the plane, and cash the check. That's the job." Marcus felt a familiar, weary pang. He wasn't offended merely, disappointed. The promise his father spoke of wasn't just about lie-flat beds and champagne. It was about respect. It was supposed to be in the company's DNA. He sank a little deeper into his seat. This was going to be a long flight. The takeoff was flawless. Captain Evans was undeniably a superb technical pilot. He guided the £500,000 machine into the sky with a grace that belied its immense size and power. The A350 climbed steeply, banking over the Atlantic, before turning west, chasing the setting sun. An hour into the flight, as the service began, and the soft clatter of cutlery filled the cabin, Marcus felt a slight, unusual vibration. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a subtle shudder through the floor that lasted only a few seconds. To most, it would be nothing, a minor tremor lost in the general hum of flight. But to Marcus, whose senses were keenly attuned to the rhythms of an aircraft, it was a data point. He cross-referenced it with their altitude, the outside air temperature displayed on the in-flight map, and the typical climb profile of the A350. His curiosity piqued, he opened his laptop and pulled up a spec sheet for the Trent XWB-84 engine. He was fascinated by its optimized climb feature, a recent software update that adjusted the thrust-to-temperature ratio for maximum fuel efficiency, especially in colder atmospheric conditions. The vibration, he hypothesized, might have been a momentary oscillation as the system calibrated itself, a harmless but interesting quirk. It was exactly the kind of technical minutiae that pilots, the good ones, loved to discuss. It was shop talk, a conversation between people who shared a passion for the machine. Later, when the meal service was over and a lull settled over the cabin, Marcus saw his chance. The cockpit door was open again. Captain Evans had stepped out to briefly speak with Sarah, the lead flight attendant. He was standing right at the front of the cabin, a figure of approachable authority. This was a common practice on Aurajet, meant to foster a connection with their premium passengers. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt. He approached the captain respectfully, waiting for him to finish his conversation. When Sarah turned away, Marcus stepped forward. "Excuse me. Captain Evans," he began, his voice calm and polite. Evans turned his practiced smile firmly in place. "Yes. Is everything all right with your suite?" "Oh yes, everything is wonderful, thank you. I just had a quick question about the aircraft, if you have a moment. I'm a bit of an aviation enthusiast." The captain's smile faltered slightly. He gave Marcus's hoodie and jeans another quick, dismissive scan. His eyes seemed to say, "An enthusiast, are you?" "I am rather busy," he said, his tone shifting from welcoming to brisk. The flight attendants can answer most general questions. I understand, Marcus persisted gently. But this is a bit more technical. I'm familiar with the Trent XWB engines, and I was curious about the new optimized climb software. About an hour ago, at around 32,000 feet, I felt a slight harmonic resonance through the airframe. I was wondering if that's a known characteristic of the system adjusting the thrust ratio in response to the sub-zero temps, or perhaps just a minor airframe shudder from clear air turbulence. The question was specific, knowledgeable, and demonstrated a genuine understanding of the aircraft's systems. It was a peer-level query disguised in a passenger's request. Captain Evans stared at Marcus. The mask of politeness dropped, completely replaced by a look of unveiled condescension. He blinked slowly, as if Marcus had just asked him if the wings were powered by magic. "Son," he said the word dripping with patronizing dismissal. "We have multi-million-dollar instruments up there to monitor the engines. They tell me everything I need to know. We don't rely on feelings from passengers." He didn't answer the question. He belittled it. He made Marcus feel small, foolish, and most of all invisible. The implication was clear. You in your casual clothes couldn't possibly comprehend the complexities of my world. Go back to your seat and watch a movie. The exchange had been quiet, but not private. A man in seat 1A, fiddling with his tablet, looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Sarah, the flight attendant who was returning to the galley, paused, her brow furrowed with concern. The air in the front of the cabin grew thick with unspoken tension. Marcus felt a hot flush of anger, but he quickly suppressed it. He had promised himself he would observe, not interfere. "I see," he said, his voice perfectly level, betraying none of his inner turmoil. "Thank you for your time, Captain." He turned and walked back to his seat, his ears burning. He hadn't been treated as a passenger with a query. He had been treated as a nuisance, a nobody. And he couldn't shake the deep gut feeling that if he had been an older white man in a bespoke suit asking the exact same question, the captain's response would have been entirely different. He would have been met with a collegial smile, a great question, and a deep dive into engine performance. Captain Evans watched him go, a faint, self-satisfied smirk on his face. He had put the upstart in his place. He turned back towards the cockpit, ready to close the door and get back to his rarefied world of instruments and control, utterly oblivious to the chain of events he had just set in motion. He had no idea that his casual act of prejudice was about to be judged by the highest possible authority. The rest of the flight passed in a state of surreal, tense silence for Marcus. He tried to focus on his work, but the captain's dismissive tone echoed in his mind. It wasn't just the rudeness, it was the galling arrogance, the assumption of ignorance, based on nothing more than his appearance. It was the antithesis of everything Aurajet was supposed to stand for. As the plane began its initial descent into the Los Angeles basin, the familiar chime for the flight crew to prepare for landing sounded. Marcus closed his laptop and looked out the window, watching the sprawling city lights emerge from the haze. Suddenly, a different chime sounded through the cabin, a crisp electronic tone he didn't recognize. Then the in-flight entertainment screen in front of him flickered and changed. Instead of the flight map, a message appeared. Incoming priority video call. Below it were two buttons. Accept and decline. Marcus stared at it, baffled. A video call. To a specific seat. This wasn't a standard feature. This was something else, something hidden in the system architecture. His heart began to pound. He knew only one person who could override the entire passenger entertainment system of a flagship aircraft in mid-flight. He pressed accept. The face that appeared on the screen was deeply familiar Robert Thorne. He was in his office, the distinctive skyline of Century City, visible through the window behind him. He looked older on the screen, the lines of stress around his eyes more pronounced. "Marcus?" His father's voice came through the high-end headphones at the seat. It was calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "I saw your flag on the flight manifest." "M. James, really? You couldn't have been a little more creative." Marcus managed a weak smile. "I wanted the real experience, Dad." "Well, it sounds like you got it." Robert's expression hardened. "I've been monitoring the cockpit comms and the internal cabin feeds. I have a remote monitoring suite here, you know that, for emergencies. Or other situations." He paused. "I heard the exchange with Captain Evans. All of it." Marcus felt a strange mix of vindication and dread. "Dad, it's fine. It's just one guy." "No, son, it's not," Robert said, his voice dropping. "It's never just one guy. He's the face of my company. He's responsible for 200 souls on that plane, and his judgment is compromised. This isn't about you being my son. This is about an employee showing contempt for a customer. The fact that the customer is my son just brings it into sharper focus." "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked. "I'm going to have a word with him," Robert said grimly. "Now, I'm patching into the cockpit's communication panel. He'll hear my voice from the speakers. Just stay put." The screen went blank. Marcus sat back, his mind racing. This was escalating far beyond what he'd ever intended. Up in the cockpit, First Officer David Miller was running through the pre-landing checklist. "Flaps 15 speed checked." "Checked," Captain Evans responded, his hands moving with practiced ease over the controls. He was in his element, a king in his domain. Suddenly a voice, rich and resonant, filled the cockpit. It wasn't from air traffic control. It emanated from the comms panel itself. "Captain Evans, this is Robert Thorne." Both pilots froze. Evans' head snapped up. He looked at Miller, whose eyes were wide with shock. Robert Thorne, the CEO, calling them directly. In the middle of a landing approach, it was unheard of, a breach of every protocol imaginable. It could only mean one thing, a catastrophic emergency. "Mr. Thorne," Evans stammered, his voice suddenly tight. "Sir, is there an emergency? What's going on?" "The only emergency, Captain," Thorne's voice replied, cold as ice, "is your stunning lack of professionalism. I'll be meeting the plane at the gate, with my head of HR and the chief of flight operations. Do not disembark. Do not speak to anyone. Is that understood?" The blood drained from Captain Evans's face. The cockpit, once his sanctuary, now felt like a trap. "Sir, I don't understand. My professionalism. This has been a textbook flight." "Your treatment of the passenger in seat 2A was not textbook. It was disgraceful," the voice boomed. "You made an assumption about him, and you were wrong. Catastrophically wrong." Evans was utterly bewildered. Seat 2A. The kid in the hoodie. The young man with the engine question. "Sir, he was a distraction during a critical phase of flight." He was grasping at straws, trying to find a professional justification for his personal prejudice. "He asked you a highly specific, technical question when you were standing in the cabin an hour after takeoff. Don't lie to me, Alan." Thorne's voice was dangerously quiet. "Now, and more importantly, don't lie to yourself." A heavy silence descended on the cockpit, broken only by the automated altitude call-outs from the flight system. 1,000. Captain Evans was flying on autopilot, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and fear. Who was the kid in 2A? A journalist, a government regulator, an FAA inspector flying incognito. His career, which he had meticulously built over 35 years, was flashing before his eyes. The plane touched down on the runway at LAX with its usual smoothness, a testament to Evans' muscle memory. But the pilot himself was a wreck. He taxied the aircraft towards the gate, his hands slick with sweat on the controls. His mind kept replaying the brief, dismissive encounter. The boy's calm, intelligent eyes, his own sneering response. "Son, we don't rely on feelings from passengers." As the jet bridge connected with a soft bump, Evans saw them through the cockpit window. A small group of people standing on the tarmac waiting. A woman in a sharp business suit, Helen Davies, the notoriously tough head of HR. A man in a pilot's uniform with 6 bars on his shoulders, Charles Wright, the chief of flight operations. And standing between them, a tall, imposing figure with an expression of cold fury, Robert Thorne. The engine spooled down their fading whine, sounding like a death knell. The seatbelt sign was extinguished. Passengers began to stir. But Captain Evans couldn't move. He just stared at the 3 figures on the tarmac, his world shrinking to that single, terrifying tableau. And then the final devastating blow. He saw the passenger from 2A, the young man in the grey hoodie, emerge from the jet bridge. He walked directly up to the waiting group. Robert Thorne, the billionaire CEO, the titan of the aviation industry, broke from the group, walked towards the young man, and put a hand on his shoulder. Through the thick, soundproof glass of the cockpit, Evans couldn't hear the words, but he could read the lips. He saw Robert Thorne look at his son, then turn his gaze directly up at the cockpit window, locking eyes with the captain. And as he did, he spoke one more time to the young man, a word that traveled through the glass and into Alan Evans' soul like a shard of ice. "Son." The revelation struck Captain Evans with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a regulator or a journalist in seat 2A. It was Marcus Thorne, the heir, the one person on the planet he could not afford to disrespect. He felt a wave of nausea, the sterile air of the cockpit suddenly suffocating. His entire body went cold, then hot. 35 years of seniority, of respect, of being the unquestioned master of his domain, all of it had just been incinerated by a single 5-second interaction born of pure, unadulterated prejudice. First Officer Miller, who had witnessed the entire drama unfold from the tarmac, turned to his captain. His face was pale, a mixture of shock and something that looked unnervingly like pity. "Captain, what do we do?" Evans couldn't answer. His mind was a frantic scramble of damage control. It was a misunderstanding. I was stressed. Pre-landing jitters. The kid looked like... He couldn't even finish the thought. What had he looked like? A threat. A nobody. The truth was, he had looked like a young black man in a hoodie. And in Evans' biased mind, that had been enough to dismiss him as someone who didn't belong. The cabin door opened. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, leaned in. "Captain, the passengers have deplaned. The ground crew is ready for the post-flight checklist." She paused, sensing the tomb-like atmosphere in the cockpit. "Is everything all right?" Before Evans could formulate a response, a sharp rap echoed on the cockpit's open door. Charles Wright, the chief of flight operations. stood there. His face, usually friendly, was a grim, unreadable mask. "Alan." "David," he said, his voice flat. "Mr. Thorne wants to see you, both of you, in the operations center. Now." He looked pointedly at Evans. "Hand over your flight bag and your company ID." The request was a punch to the gut. Surrendering your ID meant you were grounded, suspended. It was the first step towards the end of the line. Wordlessly, his hands trembling slightly, Captain Evans reached into his bag, pulled out his wallet, and handed over the plastic card that had been his key to the world for over 3 decades. Miller did the same, though Wright's gaze on him was less severe. The walk from the aircraft to the Aurajet Operations Center was the longest walk of Alan Evans' life. It was a sterile, brightly lit corridor he'd walked 1,000 times before, but today it felt like a green mile. Employees bustled past, their cheerful "Hello, Captain" greetings dying on their lips as they saw his face and the 2 grim-faced executives flanking him. The news was already spreading through the terminal like wildfire. The operations center's conference room was cold and quiet. Robert Thorne sat at the head of a long, polished table. Marcus was beside him, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. Helen Davies, the HR chief, sat opposite them, a thick folder and a pen placed neatly in front of her. "Sit down, Alan," Robert said, his voice devoid of any warmth. Evans and Miller took the chairs at the far end of the table. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Finally, Robert Thorne spoke. "I built this airline on one core principle, Alan. One. That from the moment a customer interacts with us, they are treated with absolute, unconditional respect. It doesn't matter if they're in seat 38E or 1A. It doesn't matter what they're wearing, how old they are, or the color of their skin. That principle is the foundation of our brand, our reputation, and our success. Today you took a sledgehammer to that foundation." Evans finally found his voice, though it was raspy and weak. "Mr. Thorne, Robert. It was a terrible misunderstanding. I was focused on the safety of the flight." "Don't," Robert cut him off, his voice sharp as a razor. "Don't you dare hide behind the shield of safety. You were standing in the cabin having a casual conversation with the lead flight attendant. The aircraft was on autopilot. You were not in a critical phase of flight. You were being, for all intents and purposes, a brand ambassador. And you failed spectacularly." He turned his gaze to Marcus. "My son asked you a question. Not about the weather, not about the meal service. He asked you a highly specific question about the Rolls-Royce Trent XWB engine's performance envelope. A question, I might add, that most of your co-pilots probably couldn't answer. Did you know he has a degree in aerospace engineering from MIT, that he probably knows the technical specifications of that engine better than you do?" Evans stared, dumbfounded. MIT aerospace engineering? The kid in the hoodie, the caricature in his mind, shattered into a million pieces, replaced by the portrait of a man he had grossly, insultingly underestimated. "No," Robert continued, his voice low and menacing. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to know. You took one look at him, at his clothes, at his skin, and you made a judgment. You called him son in the most demeaning way possible and dismissed him like he was a child. You didn't see a passenger. You didn't see an enthusiast. You saw someone you felt was beneath you." Evans began to stammer an apology. "I am so sorry. To you, Mr. Thorne, and to you, Marcus. It was a lapse in judgment. It will never happen again. I swear it." Marcus finally looked up, his expression not of anger, but of deep, profound disappointment. "The problem, Captain," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "is that I don't believe you. I don't think it was a lapse. I think it was a reflex. And I have to wonder, who else have you treated this way? The passenger who doesn't have the CEO on speed dial, the young flight attendant who's afraid to speak up, the co-pilot of color who you write off as an affirmative action hire." The questions hung in the air, each one a damning indictment. Evans had no answer, because the truth was, he had done all of those things. He had built his career not just on skill, but on an ingrained sense of superiority. Helen Davies, the HR chief, finally spoke, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Captain Evans, you are hereby suspended with pay, pending a full and thorough investigation into this incident. First Officer Miller," she said, turning to the younger pilot. "We will require a full statement from you as well." Miller just nodded, looking miserable. "An investigation," Evans said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "For one comment." "It is never one comment, Captain," Davies replied coolly, opening her folder. "This incident gives us cause to re-examine your entire service record, commendations and complaints. We will be speaking with flight crews you have worked with over the past 5 years. We will be thorough." Robert Thorne stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "You are not to contact any Aurajet employees during this investigation. You will be contacted by Ms. Davies's office with the next steps. You may go." Dismissed, like a disobedient child. Alan Evans, the decorated veteran. The king of the skies stood up his legs, feeling weak. He walked out of the room past the pitying and curious stares of the operations staff and out into the public area of the terminal. For the first time in his adult life, he was just a man in a pilot's uniform with nowhere to fly. He had a return flight booked to New York the next day as a passenger. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. It would be the longest, most silent flight of his life. The investigation began less than 24 hours later. It was not, as Captain Evans had desperately hoped, a mere formality. Helen Davies was a bulldog in a Chanel suit. She approached the task with a forensic intensity driven by a direct mandate from Robert Thorne. Find the truth, all of it. Her first interview was with First Officer David Miller. In a sterile, windowless room in the corporate headquarters, Miller recounted the events with nervous precision. He confirmed the conversation, Evans' dismissive tone, and the palpable shock in the cockpit when Thorne's voice came over the comms. "Did you find the captain's reaction to the passenger unusual?" Davies asked, her pen poised over a notepad. Miller hesitated. Speaking out against a senior captain was a cardinal sin in the pilot fraternity. It could brand him as a troublemaker, a snitch. But looking into Davies's unflinching eyes, he knew lying or equivocating would be worse. "Honestly," Miller said, letting out a long breath. "No, it wasn't unusual. For him." Davies's pen stopped. "Explain." "Captain Evans. He's from a different era." Miller began, choosing his words carefully. "He's an excellent pilot, technically brilliant, but his people skills are selective. He's great with high-profile passengers, politicians, CEOs. But with anyone else, he can be condescending. He calls junior flight attendants sweetheart. He once told me a few months back that our new diversity recruitment program was scraping the bottom of the barrel to meet quotas." Davies's expression didn't change, but her pen began moving rapidly. "Did you report this comment?" Miller looked down at his hands. "No. Who would I report it to? He's Alan Evans. He's a legend. I'm a first officer with 5 years on the job. It would be my word against his. It'd be career suicide." The floodgates had opened. Davies and her team began a series of confidential interviews with dozens of flight attendants, co-pilots, and gate agents who had worked with Evans. Anonymity was guaranteed, and with the powerful protection of the CEO's office behind the investigation, people began to talk. The stories painted a grim, consistent picture. It wasn't about one lapse. It was about a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior. A young Asian-American flight attendant, Jessica Chen, recounted how Evans had loudly berated her in front of passengers for serving his coffee lukewarm, calling her incompetent. She had been so humiliated, she'd cried in the galley. A black co-pilot, Captain Harris, who had flown with Evans 3 years prior, described a flight where Evans had joked to an all-white ground crew that he'd have to keep an extra eye on his co-pilot that day. Another female co-pilot recalled Evans constantly questioning her calculations and double-checking her work in a way he never did with her male counterparts, telling her the cockpit was no place for a delicate touch. Each story on its own was a he said, she said incident easily dismissed. But when compiled into the folder on Helen Davies's desk, they formed a mosaic of arrogance, sexism, and racism. Captain Evans hadn't just insulted the CEO's son. He had fostered a toxic work environment for years, hiding behind his seniority and technical skill. Meanwhile, Alan Evans was in his own personal hell. He was confined to his upscale New York apartment, the silence broken only by calls from his union representative. The rep, a weary man named Gene, was not optimistic. "Oh, this is bad," Gene said over the phone. "They're not treating this as a simple passenger complaint. They're building a character case. They're talking to everyone." "It's a witch hunt," Evans raged, "because I bruised the ego of Thorne's kid. They're trying to ruin me." "Are they?" Gene asked quietly. "Or are they just finally listening to all the people you've bruised over the years? I'm getting calls, Al, from people I represent. People who are being interviewed. They're telling me things." Evans' bluster faltered. "Lies. Exaggerations. Everyone's got an axe to grind." But in the lonely hours of the night when the anger subsided, a cold fear crept in. He remembered the flight attendant he'd yelled at. He remembered the co-pilot he'd joked about. He hadn't seen them as people. He'd seen them as props in his world's subordinate figures in the theater of his command. He had never considered the cumulative weight of his small cruelties. A week into the investigation, Helen Davies uncovered something that shifted the case from a human resources issue to a federal crime. While reviewing Evans' training records, a meticulous junior analyst on her team flagged an anomaly. For a mandatory recurrent training on emergency procedures in a flight simulator dated 18 months prior, Captain Evans was logged as having completed the 8-hour session in Chicago. But the analyst cross-referencing company expense reports and aircraft flight logs found irrefutable proof on that exact day Alan Evans was the captain on a flight from New York to London. He was in 2 places at once. Davies dug deeper. She pulled the records from the simulation center in Chicago. The sign-in sheet for that day had Evans's signature. Davies sent the sheet to a forensic handwriting expert. The call came 2 days later. "It's a forgery," the expert stated unequivocally. "A decent one, but definitively not his signature." Davies felt a chill run down her spine. This was no longer about a pilot's bad attitude. He had falsified a federal document. He had skipped mandatory safety training, a session that simulated engine failures, emergency landings, and cabin fires, and had a friend or colleague forge his name, all so he wouldn't have to bother with the inconvenience. For the past 18 months, Captain Alan Evans had been flying hundreds of thousands of passengers without the proper legally required safety certification. She picked up the phone and dialed Robert Thorne. "Robert," she said, her voice grave, "we have a much bigger problem, and I need to contact the FAA." The king was not just being dethroned, he was about to be buried. The involvement of the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, transformed the situation instantly. What had been an internal corporate matter, however serious, was now a federal investigation with the potential for criminal charges. The focus pivoted from Captain Evans's behavior to the one thing that transcended all else in the aviation world: passenger safety. Robert Thorne was furious. The news that one of his senior captains had deliberately falsified safety training records struck him like a physical blow. Aurajet's entire brand was built on a promise of unparalleled safety and professionalism. Evans hadn't just been arrogant. He had been reckless. He had gambled with the lives of every single passenger and crew member on every flight he had commanded for the last year and a half. "I want to know how this happened," Thorne ordered Davies and his Chief of Operations, Charles Wright, in an emergency meeting. "I want to know who signed him off. I want every single training record for every pilot we employ audited going back 5 years. I don't care what it costs. Tear the whole system down and rebuild it if you have to. This can never happen again." The internal audit at Aurajet began with a frantic, terrifying energy. For the investigators at the FAA, however, the pace was deliberate and methodical. They subpoenaed the records from the Chicago Simulation Center, interviewed the instructors, and began a deep dive into Evans's entire career history. For Alan Evans, the world had shrunk to the 4 walls of his apartment and the increasingly strained voice of his union lawyer on the phone. The initial charge of unprofessional conduct seemed almost quaint now. He was facing an FAA inquiry that could lead to the permanent revocation of his airline transport pilot ATP license, the very document that gave him his identity. "Why, Al?" His lawyer, Gene, asked, his voice a mixture of exasperation and disbelief. "Why would you skip a sim session of all the stupid things to do?" "It was a scheduling conflict," Evans shot back, his voice cracking with desperation. "I had a family thing. It was important. I'd done the damn training 20 times before. It's the same scenarios over and over. I paid one of the junior instructors $1,000 to sign me off. I never thought anyone would check. It was a confession born of panic, and it was precisely what the FAA investigators were looking for. They soon located the young instructor, a man barely in his 30s, who, when faced with the threat of federal prosecution and the end of his own nascent career, confessed immediately. He had taken the money, forged the signature, and filed the paperwork. It was a simple, stupid crime of opportunity, but for the FAA, it was a mortal sin. The news of the falsified record was strategically leaked to a prominent aviation news outlet. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, and the fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Evans's reputation. The narrative was no longer about a rude pilot. It was about a reckless, fraudulent one who had endangered the public. The pilot forums and aviation blogs lit up with condemnation. In a profession built on integrity and trust, Alan Evans had become a pariah overnight. His former colleagues, even those who had once admired him, now spoke of him in hushed, scornful tones. He hadn't just broken a rule. He had betrayed the entire fraternity. Marcus Thorne watched the drama unfold from a distance in Los Angeles. He felt no sense of victory, only a heavy sadness. His simple, honest question had inadvertently pulled a single loose thread that had caused an entire rotten tapestry to unravel. He had wanted accountability, not complete destruction. He called his father. Dad, this has gone so much further than I ever expected. The FAA, possible criminal charges. Is this really necessary? Robert Thorne was silent for a moment, on the other end of the line. Marcus, he said, his voice heavy. When you told me what happened on that flight, I was angry because he disrespected you. But now I am terrified because he disrespected the responsibility he holds. The two are connected. The arrogance that allowed him to dismiss you is the same arrogance that allowed him to believe he was above safety regulations. One is an insult, the other is a potential catastrophe. We didn't cause this. We just turned on the lights, and this is what was hiding in the dark. He did this to himself. The twist in the investigation had sealed Evans' fate. There was no coming back. Aurajet's internal review was now a formality. Helen Davies prepared her final report. It was a thick, damning document detailing not just the incident with Marcus, but the long history of complaints, and crowning it all the unforgivable sin of the falsified safety record. The meeting to deliver the verdict was held via video conference. Alan Evans appeared on the screen from his lawyer's office. He looked like a different man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a grey, hollowed-out exhaustion. His silver hair seemed less lustrous, his sharp jawline softened by stress and sleepless nights. Helen Davies read the conclusions of the report in a steady, emotionless voice. Based on the pattern of unprofessional conduct, the creation of a hostile work environment for multiple crew members, and the willful falsification of federally mandated safety training documents, Aurajet is terminating your employment effective immediately. Evans didn't even argue. He just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the camera. Furthermore, Davies continued, all of our findings, including witness statements and evidence of the forged documents, have been turned over to the FAA and the Department of Transportation. They will conduct their own proceedings regarding your license and any potential criminal liability. The call ended. For Alan Evans, it wasn't just the end of a job. It was the end of his life as he knew it. He was a captain with no airline, a pilot who would likely never legally fly again. He had flown too close to the sun, not on wings of wax and feather, but on wings of pure arrogance. And the fall back to earth was going to be a long and brutal one. Karma, when it finally arrives, is rarely a single dramatic lightning strike. More often, it is a slow, grinding erosion, a dismantling of a life piece by painful piece. For the man who was once Captain Alan Evans, the termination from Aurajet was only the beginning of his hard landing. The FAA proceedings were swift and brutal. Presented with irrefutable evidence of the forgery and a confession from the instructor, the panel took less than an hour to deliberate. They permanently revoked his ATP license. The official letter arriving by certified mail was a single page that effectively erased his 35-year career. The gold bars on his uniform were now just meaningless trinkets. The financial consequences hit next. His termination for cause meant he was denied the lucrative severance package he would have received upon retirement. His stock options worth millions were voided. The lavish pension he had been counting on was significantly reduced, penalized for gross misconduct. Within months, the man who had lived a life of first-class travel and five-star hotels was consulting with bankruptcy lawyers. He was forced to sell the spacious Manhattan apartment with its panoramic views of the city. He moved to a small, nondescript rental in a New Jersey suburb. The roar of planes from nearby Newark Airport, a constant mocking reminder of the world he had lost. But the most profound punishment was social. In the tight-knit, high-status world of airline pilots, he was radioactive. Former friends and colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. Calls went unreturned. The respect and deference he had commanded, which he had mistaken for genuine affection, evaporated overnight. He learned the hard lesson that people hadn't liked him. They had been in awe of his position. Without the captain's uniform, he was just Alan, a bitter, unemployed man in his late 50s with a tarnished reputation. He tried to find other work in aviation consulting teaching, but his name was toxic. The story of the Aurajet scandal, especially the safety violation, had made him unemployable in the industry he loved. He ended up taking a job managing the vehicle fleet for a limousine service, a position he got through a cousin who took pity on him. He spent his days in a cramped, windowless office, coordinating schedules for drivers, the irony lost on no one. He had gone from commanding a $300 million Airbus to managing a fleet of Lincoln town cars. Contrastingly, the incident became a catalyst for positive change at Aurajet. Shaken to its core, the company underwent a radical cultural overhaul spearheaded by Marcus Thorne himself. He declined a formal executive role, preferring to act as a special advisor to the board on culture and passenger experience. Using the data from the Evans investigation, he helped implement a new, truly anonymous reporting system for employees called True North, allowing them to flag misconduct without fear of reprisal. He championed a new mentorship and mutual respect program, pairing senior captains with junior flight crew to break down the old hierarchies. The training modules were redesigned to include immersive simulations, focused not just on technical skills, but on de-escalation cultural sensitivity and unconscious bias. Aurajet's brand took an initial hit from the scandal, but under Robert and Marcus's transparent leadership, they spun it into a story of renewal. They openly admitted their failings and publicly detailed the steps they were taking to fix them. The story of what happened to Captain Evans became a cautionary tale, whispered in every break room and training center, a stark reminder that a pilot's character was as critical as their stick and rudder skills. Marcus never gloated. In fact, he felt a lingering sense of unease about the totality of Evans's downfall. One evening, he was having dinner with his father at his home in Bel Air. "I saw an article about him," Marcus said quietly, swirling the wine in his glass. "The limo company. It feels disproportionate. All for a single rude comment." Robert Thorne put down his fork and looked at his son. "It was never about the comment, Marcus. That was just the symptom. The disease was arrogance. The kind of arrogance that makes a man believe he is infallible, that the rules don't apply to him, that he can judge a person's worth by the clothes they wear. Today he falsifies a safety log. Tomorrow he ignores a co-pilot's warning because he thinks he knows better, and a plane goes down. We didn't punish him for what he did that day. We held him accountable for who he is. And in his profession, that person is a liability." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the grim logic. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting the future. The hard karma that hit Captain Evans wasn't just losing his job or his money. It was the complete stripping away of the identity he had so carefully constructed. He was no longer captain. He was just Alan. And without the uniform, the title and the power, he was forced for the first time in his life to look at the man in the mirror and confront the emptiness that had been there all along. 2 years passed. Aurajet, having weathered the storm, was thriving. Its renewed focus on employee culture and customer respect had earned it accolades, and the True North program was being studied by other airlines as a model for corporate accountability. Marcus Thorne had found his calling not in a cockpit, but in the complex human systems that made the machines fly. He had helped build a better, more humane airline. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Marcus was flying from New York back to Los Angeles. He was in seat 1A this time, a last-minute trip booked by his father's office. As he settled in, he watched the ground operations through the window, the ballet of baggage handlers and fuel trucks moving with purpose in the downpour. A black town car pulled up near the gate. A man in a simple black suit and tie got out holding a large umbrella and escorted a wealthy-looking couple to a gate agent. The driver was methodical, efficient, but there was a stoop to his shoulders, a weariness in his movements. As he turned to go back to his car, his face was briefly illuminated by the terminal lights. It was Alan Evans. He looked years older than the last time Marcus had seen him on that video call. The silver hair was thinner, the face deeply lined. The piercing blue eyes that had once scanned horizons from 30,000 feet were now dull-focused on the wet tarmac in front of him. He didn't look up at the magnificent A350 he had once commanded. It was as if the sight of it was too painful to bear. He got back into his car and drove away, just another anonymous part of the airport's vast machinery. Marcus watched him disappear into the rain, a profound sense of closure washing over him. There was no pleasure in the man's downfall, but there was a rightness to it. The universe had balanced its books. Later, as the Aurajet flight climbed through the clouds and into the brilliant sunshine, the new captain's voice came over the intercom. She was a woman, her voice warm and confident. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Eva Rostova, and on behalf of First Officer David Miller and the entire crew, I'd like to welcome you aboard Aurajet Flight 77 to Los Angeles." Marcus smiled. David Miller, the young co-pilot who had been so terrified in that cockpit 2 years ago, was now flying right seat on the flagship route. He had found his voice testified honestly during the investigation, and his career had flourished in the new, healthier culture. He was a symbol of the airline's future. Captain Rostova continued, "Here at Aurajet, we know you have a choice in who you fly with. We believe our job isn't just to get you to your destination safely and on time, but to ensure you feel seen, valued, and respected every moment you're in our care. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. We're honored to have you with us today." Marcus leaned his head back against the soft leather of his seat. He looked out the window at the endless blue sky. It was the same sky Alan Evans had once ruled. But now it was being navigated by a new generation, a generation that understood that the most important instruments in any cockpit were not the dials and gauges, but humility, respect, and character. The karma had been hard, but it had also been cleansing, leaving behind a clearer, brighter sky for everyone. The story of Captain Evans isn't just about one man's downfall. It's a powerful reminder that true character isn't what you show to the world when the spotlight is on. It's how you behave when you think no one important is watching. Arrogance can build an empire, but it's a foundation of sand ready to be washed away by the tide of truth. Marcus Thorne didn't seek revenge. He sought a better standard, proving that a single voice asking a single question can become the catalyst for fundamental change. It reminds us that accountability is not a punishment, but a necessary course correction on the flight path of life. If this story of justice and consequence resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more true life stories where karma delivers the final verdict. And let me know in the comments below, what do you believe is the true measure of a person's character?